I had a few problems with the sound and everything on this presentation, so I'm doing a studio version at home here. So you'll remember the class we had on William Blake and the spirit of revolution. Basically, I wanted to introduce the romantic idea of revolution, reaction against a number of things, partly a repressive, oppressive society. You'll remember all the social control that forced people away from the land and into the factories, and partly also a reaction against the logic, the science, the rationalism of the Enlightenment, which had led to the factories, in the sense that it was the science that provided the means for the factories to develop with their machines and so on, that all of course required technical knowledge to create. They were inventions based on science, and the Romantics were rebelling against the whole direction that society was taking, and in a sense they were the first sort of protest poets. So I particularly want to look at William Blake because he represents that spirit very, very strongly. There's nothing like a little bit of Mick Jagger to wake you up on a Wednesday morning. And his famous song, Sympathy for the Devil, shows a similar feeling in the 1960s to what Blake was saying back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In Milton's poem Paradise Lost, he tells the story of the devil, Satan, and how he was thrown out of heaven by God just because he would not obey God. He would not just do what God said. Now, Milton's intention in writing this poem is to justify the ways of God to men, but a lot of people have noticed that Satan has courage. He is a persuasive character. He's somebody that readers can feel sympathy for the devil, as the Rolling Stones puts it. And Blake was very quick to see this sympathetic side of Milton's Satan, and his way of putting it was that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. We can see in this painting, which is Satan smiting Job with sore boils, Satan looking very heroic and full of energy, and Blake admired this idea. He wasn't criticizing Milton when he said that Milton was of the devil's party. In fact, he himself basically supported rebellion against tyranny. Milton's position was very different. Milton was, of course, writing over 100 years earlier at the time of the Puritan Revolution, but Milton had supported Oliver Cromwell and supported the killing of the king, who had his head chopped off by the Puritans at the end of the Puritan Revolution. Blake is in a different context. He supported the big revolutions of the 19th century, the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, and his support for these things was based on the idea that you have to have these opposites. You have to have these conflicts. You have to have these contraries. If you don't have these contraries, these opposite things, there's no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate, he writes. These things are necessary to human existence. And he goes on to say, from these contraries spring what the religious call good and evil. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active, springing from energy. So he sees good as simply being passive, simply obeying, doing what one's told, and active expression of the human spirit, which of course is very important for the artist and the poet. Active expression comes from energy, and he says that the religious call that evil. Good is heaven, he says, evil is hell. Oops. Well, we keep going back. Oh dear. Okay, I don't know why that happened. Anyway, those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. In other words, in Blake's understanding, the good, as they're called, are not really good. They're simply people who repress or suppress their natural desires. And the restrainer or reason usurps its place and governs the unwilling, so that one allows oneself to be controlled by reason instead of expressing one's imagination. And by being restrained, it, that is the desire, becomes passive till it is only the shadow of desire. The history of this is written in Paradise Lost, in Milton's poem, he says, and the governor or reason is called Messiah. Well, Messiah, of course, is Jesus Christ in the Bible. Messiah is the person who is bringing God's message to earth. And basically, Blake is saying that he doesn't agree with that message, in the sense that he feels that the creative spirit is a positive thing, and it's something that he wants to be part of. He doesn't want to repress or suppress himself with logic and reason and those kinds of things. And of course, the devil was originally the highest of the angels. The Bible seems to suggest this. And Milton certainly develops this very strongly, that Satan, or the devil, was the greatest of all the angels before being pushed out by God, simply for saying, no, I'm not going to obey you just because you're God. I have my own energy, I have my own spirit, and I want to express that. And so in the book of Job, Milton's Messiah is called Satan. So Milton's Messiah is not Jesus Christ. In other words, Milton is of the devil's party, like Blake himself. So it's a kind of confusion of values, very similar to the Rolling Stones in the 1960s and that whole sort of hippie movement, really, that youth movement in the 1960s. Sympathy for the Devil expresses the idea that we don't accept the values of our society. Here he is in the painting The Ancient of Days. He's a negative figure. He creates laws and boundaries and limitations in Blake's mythology. And he is represented here with a pair of compasses. The compasses show the scientific method, the measuring, the calculating, the logic, the reason. And although Urizen is different from God, the name of the painting, The Ancient of Days, suggests very strongly that this is how Blake sees the Christian God, because the Ancient of Days is one of the names that's given to God in the Bible, in the book of Daniel. So there's an explicit comparison between Urizen and the Christian God. Sorry if this is a bit difficult, a bit complicated, but I think you might come to see what I'm talking about if we take a look at some of his, or one in particular, of Blake's other works, which is a painting showing the scientist Newton. Now Newton, again, is showing using a pair of compasses, and Isaac Newton, of course, is the scientist who discovered the law of gravity. He is one of the figures of the Enlightenment who's developing a logical, scientific approach to the world. And Blake is very much against Newton, which shows us the kind of thinking that leads to him feeling that he's against God. In this way of showing Urizen creating the world using a pair of compasses, we are seeing a parallel with Newton, who also develops scientific method based on logic and reason, and again symbolized by a pair of compasses. Blake's world of the imagination was a fourfold vision. That is to say, he would be seeing things in 4 different ways when he was looking at things from the point of view of the pure imagination. And he would see things in 3 different ways when he was engaged in love and making love. Making love he calls Beulah's Night in the following little poem. So let me just move on here and show you what Blake says about all of this. Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night, and twofold always. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. So this rational scientific approach to life he sees as single vision. He calls it Newton's sleep. He doesn't see that this way of looking only at the world through the eyes of logic and reason is a positive thing. For him, imagination, the fourfold vision, is the important thing. In other words, Newton represented for Blake a limited way of seeing things based on logic and reason. These were the enemies of the creative imagination of the artist. And the same compasses as Newton is using represent the oppressive limitations of Urizen, the god of reason. Your reason. What this god of reason has done, in Blake's way of thinking, is taken away man's essential and highest nature, his creative nature, which is represented through the figure of Orthona in his mythology. Orthona, of course, earth owner. We should all be earth owners. We should not be trapped or victims. But what has happened in Blake's mythology and his understanding is that Orthona has lost his original nature and has taken on a different nature. Orthona has become lost. which obviously means loss, losing his nature, his essential eternal nature. And it's also the sun in Latin backwards. So it represents a kind of spiritual darkness. And this is what Earth Owner has become. And this is how he sees humanity suffering under the oppressive rule of God. Well, he's got a very complicated system going here, obviously, and at another level, Urizen and Earth Owner are just aspects of the immortal state of man. We don't really need to go into all of this complex mythology today. We couldn't if we wanted to. It's too much of it and it's too difficult. But the point is that he created this mythology inspired by Milton, loosely based on the Bible, but unique to himself, and that's the very point. It must be a unique system made by himself, because if not, if he doesn't create his own system, he feels he will be enslaved by another man's system. So the creative imagination, making his own belief system, making his own mythology, is very important to him. And we get other romantic poets who are also inspired by the events in France and the spirit of revolution. They see it as a new dawn. And it's this sense that there's a new possibility for humanity to express itself and be free and live a different kind of life. Wordsworth expressed it like this: bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. He didn't continue thinking like that. Both he and Wordsworth were horrified by the bloodshed that developed as the revolution progressed. It became a kind of bloodbath. We can see that here. Men separated, young men here separated from their women, who are left lying chaotically on the ground while horses trample over them and people trample over them, and the men themselves are being taken off in a cart to have their heads chopped off. This is what the revolution ended up representing in the minds of most English people, and they feared the possibility that something like this might happen in England, in Britain. So the 19th century is in many ways a reaction that is driven by the fear that something like this could happen in Britain. So it's a century of social reform. Let's reform society so that we don't have a revolution. Let's give people enough of what they want so that they remain satisfied. But the Romantic movement was basically a reaction against the scientific rationalism that had produced the Industrial Revolution. The Romantic movement was based in a kind of exuberant enthusiasm, and the spirit of revolution was central to that. So when we look at the Romantics, we need to see them in their social context. The period of the French Revolution, the aftermath of the American War of Independence, and so on. And of course, the Industrial Revolution, which is what I'm going to talk about in the second half of our class today. We're going to look at a couple of poems that I hope will help you to understand the Romantic view of nature and how they felt that nature was all-powerful and should be respected, rather than this society based on scientific rationalism, which had created the factories and the machines that were giving people an oppressed life as servants to the great machine of market forces and production.